Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tom Rice. I work for the Agency for Persons with Disabilities, APD. I coordinate our Zero Tolerance Initiative against abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Thank you so much for coming. In addition to working at APD, I'm also the parent of 4 children, 2 of whom have developmental disabilities. And as we'll find out, they're particularly susceptible and vulnerable to abuse, neglect, and exploitation. So let me go ahead and get started. We're calling this the silent epidemic for a reason. First, the epidemic piece of that, as you'll see, that we're gonna have a lot of statistics and data and numbers to show that people with developmental disabilities here in Florida, in the nation, worldwide, are really being victimized at a really alarming rate. The silent piece of it has to do with it's not a subject that anybody really enjoys talking about. You don't really hear about it unless there's some horrific issue, say in a nursing home or assisted living facility or something really heinous you might read about in the newspaper, but you really don't hear about it or want to talk about it. A lot of people are under the assumption that, well, my kid doesn't live in this kind of setting, so I don't have to worry about that. But as you'll see, abuse, neglect, exploitation can happen to anybody with a developmental disability, regardless of where they live, who they are, how old they are, what sex they are, etc. So it really is something that we need to talk about. It's very important. We need to talk about it so we can help protect people from being victimized. So again, thank you so much for coming. I know there's a lot of competing, let me go ahead and shut this. There's a lot of competing sessions here, so again, thank you so much for coming. Okay, why are people with developmental disabilities being abused, neglected, and exploited? Well, to answer that question, you first have to kind of put yourself in the shoes of someone with a developmental disability. You have to think about, for example, everything you did to get into this room today. All the things that you did. You woke up, you got out of bed, maybe you went to the bathroom, brushed your teeth, maybe you took some medication, got dressed, maybe, took some money out of the ATM, just a lot of different things, that you did. Now, imagine having a developmental disability, whether you have some type of cognitive impairment, like an intellectual disability or autism, or say you have a physical impairment, like cerebral palsy, spina bifida, etc. So all those things I just mentioned, all those things that a lot of folks take for granted, you have to rely on someone else to do those things for you. It could be a family member, it could be a stranger, it could be like a paid service provider that you really hardly know. So you're having that person really involved in your life with these really personal, intimate activities. So there's a lot of opportunities for bad things to happen if that person either intends to abuse, neglect, or exploit you, or if maybe that person isn't properly trained or doesn't really know how to provide good care. So we'll get into that in a little bit, and we're going to talk a lot about statistics and all, but just keeping in mind that that there are real people behind the numbers, and that anytime somebody is abused, neglected, or exploited, it really is just turning their world upside down. There's been just so many good things happening with people with developmental disabilities in the world right now. They're living in the community, they're getting jobs, etc. All wonderful things, but you really can't enjoy the full benefits of life in society today if you're being harmed, if you're being abused, neglected, or exploited. I would like to say we've got a lot of information. This is normally like a half a day training that I'm kind of condensing into the space of an hour. So if you could just hold your questions till the very end. I want to make sure we get through everything. And then really focusing on the prevention and safety planning aspect of it, which I think is the most important. So there'll be a little bit of time for questions and answers at the end. If you don't feel comfortable speaking in public, raising a question, talk to me afterwards. We've got my business card is up here on the table. And then I'll also be working at the APD booth in the exhibit hall tomorrow from 8 to 10, so if you'd like to talk to me then. Or I've also got my email and phone number if you want to talk to me privately. Feel free to do that. A lot of times people don't want to talk about something particularly sensitive or private that they or a loved one is going through. So I'll be happy to do that. So the purpose of today is really just to talk about, to increase awareness, to talk about the prevalence of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. You always say, like with drug and alcohol treatment programs, the first step to really to recovery is really admitting you have a problem, just recognizing that this is a problem that anyone with a developmental disability is susceptible to. Secondly, we really want to have people look for the common signs and symptoms of abuse, neglect, and exploitation, and what they need to do when they see those things in themselves or a loved one. And finally, like I said, the most important aspect is really preventing these crimes from occurring in the first place. That's really what our main goal is. When we talk about abuse, neglect, exploitation, it's important to understand what we mean by those terms. A lot of people have different views of what they are, but those terms are actually defined in the law, in state law, in Florida statutes. I'm not going to read them, they're pretty lengthy, but I have a copy of this PowerPoint presentation up here. Make sure y'all take the handouts up on this front row here so you can see it for yourself. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we have definitions for abuse of a child, abuse of adults with developmental disabilities. When we talk about abuse, it can be hitting, pushing, pulling. It can be verbal. It can be involve over-medicating people. There's a lot of, it's not just a physical kind of action when we speak about abuse. And when we're talking about these caregivers, I mentioned earlier, whether it be family, paid caregivers, unpaid caregivers, etc. These are just some examples of some things that would constitute abuse as far as the Florida statutes define them. Over-medicating people, as I said, rough physical movements, bathing people in water that's too hot or too cold. As I said, it's not just a physical aspect when we're talking about abuse. We can talk about harassment, insulting people, demeaning them, etc. Really, again, it's all would be considered abuse as the law defines it. Some other things that, again, falling in the category, I'm not going to go through each of these. These are included in the PowerPoint we've got up here. But in moving people with physical impairments, moving them roughly or abruptly, etc. People with visual impairments, moving them in that manner. When we talk about neglect, and again, we're focusing on children now at this point, we kind of go back and forth with children and adults because the statutory definitions are a little bit different for each. We talk about when a caregiver is depriving someone of food, of medicine, etc. They have the ability to provide those things, but they're choosing not to do that. The same, like I say, the difference for an adult, it's slightly different, but along the same lines. The caregiver who is responsible for giving that person their medication, for maybe getting them out of bed in the morning, getting them dressed, giving them food, etc., are not doing those things that they are responsible for doing, and the person can't do it themselves. Florida statutes also has a little section of neglect called self-neglect. That is, say, a person with developmental disability, and we see this a lot with some of our senior citizens who maybe are engaging in behaviors or doing certain things that are putting themselves at risk. Some examples of neglect, as I said, leaving people on the commodes for too long, not giving them medication, if they need crutches or any kind of AFOs, any kind of devices like that, they're not providing that with them, not transferring them, as I said, not giving them food, etc. Neglect has an environmental component too. If the house that the caregiver is providing for that person with a developmental disability is unsafe, that person has a means to fix things, but they've got needles, drugs, knives laying around, etc. That could be considered environmental neglect. When we talk about exploitation, we're talking about financial exploitation. This is when someone, as I said earlier, maybe they're helping the person manage their money. Maybe what part of their job, say, is to help you pay your bills, pay your rent. So they have access to that person's checkbook or their ATM card, etc. And they're basically using that authority, that position to really take money, take possessions, etc., from the person. As I said, some examples here. This can be done, actually, you could call it stealing. You could be tricking someone into saying, well, it's, a lot of times we'll see maybe somebody's job is to, say, as a transportation provider, to take you from your house to, say, school or work or something like that. And it's already, say, paid for through the Medicaid waiver, for example. And that sometimes, in some cases, we've seen that transportation provider may tell the person incorrectly that, hey, you've got to pay me $20. Medicaid doesn't cover all this. You need to pay $20, or you need to pay for my oil change, or put gas in my car, et cetera, like that. And obviously that would not be something that's allowable, and would be considered financial exploitation. Again, another form of abuse, what we would call sexual misconduct. And then this is in Florida law, where you have a service provider who engages in sexual activity with the person to whom they're providing services. And part of the issue there is the person who's receiving the services may be in a vulnerable position. They may think that they don't have the ability to say no when somebody's making these kind of sexual advances to them, and they may be tricked into doing it. It's actually unethical, in terms of what a service provider can and should do, but it's also illegal. And as I said, it's called sexual misconduct, and it's actually a felony in Florida. Again, when somebody who's maybe not acting in a caregiving role is abusing a person who's elderly or a disabled adult, in this case of Florida statutes, this is actually a felony, a first-degree felony as well. There's a separate, those individuals would be considered a protected class. So when you do these horrible things to this person, it actually comes along with a pretty hefty penalty. As I said, this is the epidemic part of the silent epidemic, unfortunately. There's been a lot of research, a lot of data. We've looked at, I look at data myself for APD clients living in Florida, and all the numbers say the same thing. There's just unfortunately, just far too much abuse and neglect and exploitation. I guess any amount would be too much, but the numbers are really staggering. It's estimated that, and this is one national study, so that 90% of people with intellectual disabilities will experience some form of sexual violence at some point in their life. That could be someone maybe grabbing them inappropriately, all the way to full-on rape, sexual assault kind of things. A lot of times people are not even reporting. So we think a lot of these statistics are really it's really underreporting if you look at this. As I said, we're looking at women with and without disabilities, men with and without disabilities, children with and without, comparing the two groups. And obviously, as you see here, the prevalence of abuse, neglect, and exploitation is much, much higher when you're talking about individuals with disabilities, for the reasons I said earlier. And we'll get into that in a little bit when we talk about how it's occurring, who the perpetrators are, et cetera, because that all leads into the prevention section. We'll talk about it in a little bit. When we talk about sexual abuse, for example, it's not a one-time thing, unfortunately. It's going to occur over and over and over again. As you can see by this pie chart from this study that was done back in '92, 64% of the time it's happening at least more than 10 times. Same with exploitation. There was a big study done in 2001 that looked at financial exploitation committed against elderly individuals and adults with developmental disabilities, and also finding, again, the underreporting here. Only 1 in 14 cases they estimate are even getting reported. I touched on this a little bit before when we talk about, well, why is this population being abused, neglected, and exploited? Well, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times they may be physically unable to defend themselves. They require this assistance, as I said, with some of the most personal, intimate tasks. They really rely on somebody else to do. They really rely on somebody else do those tasks. So there's the opportunity for that to occur. Thank you, I appreciate it. And a lot of times they may not be considered credible reporters, unfortunately. They may tell somebody something is happening, but they're not believed. A lot of times they may not know, and this again is going to feed into the prevention aspect, is a lot of times they may not know that this is not okay, what is happening to them. Maybe it's all they've ever known, especially if the perpetrator of the abuse or neglect is say a parent, and a lot of times it is. That's what they lived with their whole life. They don't know any different. They think this is how life is. They may be socially isolated. There may not be a lot of other eyes and ears out there to be involved in the person's life, so they have nobody to tell that something bad is happening to them. As I said, when we're looking at what does the data show, we'll say, well, what are the risk factors? As I said, dependence upon others is the key here. As I said, you're relying upon those other individuals, whether it be paid or unpaid caregivers, to these really personal, intimate tasks. Maybe the person doesn't have a job. They don't have means to leave the person who's abusing or neglecting them. Maybe they don't have that education or information to know, okay, this is not okay what's happening here. This is how I should be expected to be treated with respect and dignity and good humane care. As I said, they may be socially isolated. They don't have a lot of other people around in their lives that, so that they're, in the eyes of a perpetrator, that's a really good victim, because then there's nobody else they can tell about these issues. They may not even be able to speak. A lot of times they may be nonverbal. So and if they have no means to communicate through like a communication board or signing, etc., again makes it very difficult. And going back to the data, and this is important to understand what's happening, just so that we can help figure out how to reduce risk. We'll talk about that people with developmental disabilities experience a lot of different types of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. It's not just, okay, I was financially exploited and that's all I need to worry about, because that's been taken care of. No, unfortunately, they could be the victim of sexual abuse, then a couple of years later, financial exploitation, and then say neglect, etc. So there's a lot of things that we're seeing. A lot of different perpetrators, not always just the same person we see. Maybe it was when you were living at home, it was maybe mom or dad or a relative. You've grown up, you're moved out of that situation. Maybe say you live in a group home now or in a supported living kind of environment. Now maybe it's your service providers in those settings that are abusing, neglecting, or exploiting you. The abuse, neglect, or exploitation is occurring over a long period of time. As I said, it just doesn't happen, okay, within this couple weeks period I was abused, neglected, or exploited. It goes on a lot longer before it's detected, reported, and ultimately stopped. As I said, people are likely to remain in these situations. That really increases their vulnerability, because then they're staying there, and the perpetrator says, well, this is what I'm doing, I'm getting away with it, so I'm going to continue with it or escalate when it comes to abuse, neglect, and exploitation. When we talk about, as I said earlier, when we talk about abuse, neglect, and exploitation, people have certain ideas about where things are occurring. And a lot of times, as I said, you read the papers, you think, oh, it's all about the group homes, or it's all about assisted living facilities, etc. But again, what the data is showing, it's really occurring in any setting. It's most often occurring in a person's home, which makes sense, because that's where you spend the most time, and that's where you're really the most vulnerable. That's where you're going to be, needing to take a bath, needing to get your medications, needing to get a lot of meals, etc. And there's a lot of opportunity, as I said, for bad things to happen to you. So it's really the home environment. Now, it could be a licensed home, like an ALF or a group home, etc. But it could also be the family home, person's own home or apartment. Again, a lot of misconceptions and stereotypes we might have in our minds about who are the abusers, who is abusing, neglecting, and exploiting. Maybe you picture this guy up here, kind of a shadowy figure. And so we think, oh, it's just somebody, you know, with dark glasses, and, you know, it's just kind of this stranger. So, but that's unfortunately not the case. And it's important to understand that, because then when we talk about, you know, who these perpetrators are, we don't need to focus our prevention efforts on like teaching stranger danger. Now, certainly we all need to be careful around people we don't know that well, but what the research is showing is someone who is usually known to the victim. Somebody who has access to their money, to their bodies, etc. So it's whether that be a paid caregiver, an unpaid caregiver, family member, friend, etc. It's somebody who has access to the person. It's somebody who is known by the person. So that's actually who the perpetrators are. When we talk about sexual abuse, it's usually male are the perpetrators. But it could represent any person, any race, any income level, education level, etc., any age. It really doesn't matter. There is no one, you know, profile that you can point to. The one thing that's very important to point out is, and we'll talk about this later when we talk about the prevention part of it, is anyone with a history of your past behavior is the most important predictor of your future behavior. So if you have a history of abusing, neglecting, or exploiting someone in the past, you're going to do it again and again and again until you're caught and really removed from this vulnerable population, so you don't have that opportunity and that access anymore. Now, this is something we kind of put together and just looking at you know, what's happening here in Florida, but again, I say this is occurring nationwide and internationally. We can kind of group the types of caregivers who abuse, neglect, or exploit into two categories. And it's very important to understand what's going on in their heads and what's happening in these situations as we begin to talk about prevention and safety planning. First group we could talk about is the unable to provide care in a safe way. You know, that's not abusive, neglectful, or exploitative. These individuals say that maybe they're not intending to harm anybody. Maybe they just don't know what the you know, they've never been trained. They don't know how to properly administer medications. They don't know what this person's you know, a lot of times we see this in areas where people have behavioral issues. We see if there's a person has a behavior plan, well, that says, okay, these are the target behaviors. These are what I should do when the person engages in these behaviors. This is how I should, you know, react and intervene and all that. Well, a lot of times we'll see that, well, people who are providing that care don't necessarily know how to, you know, they don't know anything about the behavior plan, or they don't know how to properly respond to behavioral issues. We see a lot of times in family homes where people are just, say, put in timeout and put in a locked room for like hours and hours and hours. I saw a case where you know, the child had autism. One of the behaviors she was engaging in was biting, and so the mom, you know, thought that, again, mom not thinking, you know, not being properly trained in any way. Mom thought, well, I'm going to bite her just so she could see how it feels. And so the mom, it escalated more and more, because obviously the daughter didn't care whether the mom was biting her. So it became worse and worse until there were pretty significant bites on the child from the mother. And that was just the case of the mom not knowing, not being trained. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. A lot of times caregivers may have intellectual disabilities, may have mental illness. They you know, are not really equipped to provide care. I mean, I know as a parent of 2 children with developmental disabilities, you really have to be on your game. You have to bring your A game, you know, every day. You have to really be aware of what you're doing. You have to know, you know, about medication, about it, you know, proper procedures for, you know, whatever supervision. I need to make sure I know where my daughter is at all times, etc. But that's why it's very important to be, you know, it's very difficult to do when you're having an intellectual disability yourself, or a mental illness, or as we said, you could be impaired due to drugs or alcohol. Very, very difficult to provide safe, humane care. Also, too, we see this a lot of times with all the the baby boomers getting older, and now they've been caring for their adult son or daughter their whole lives in their homes, and now they're in their 80s. Maybe somebody's got some, dementia creeping in, or they have some physical issues. They can't do the lifting they used to be able to do. They might start forgetting medications or meals, etc. So again, they're not, intending to harm their child, but it's happening because of their declining health and their physical conditions. Also, too, individuals can be overly stressed, overly tired, and this applies to both paid caregivers and unpaid caregivers. I mean, where there's a lot of times where you have a child, say, who doesn't maybe sleep all night, and then you're not going to be in the next morning, and they start engaging in a behavioral issue, or you may just snap. You're just not as patient as you really could and should be. Now, that's not to say that's an excuse. None of these things are excuses for abusing anything or exploiting somebody. I mean, we're all tired. We all have experienced some stress in our lives, but it's just a factor that kind of goes into that unable side. And there are things we can do about that, and we'll talk about that as far as respite for caregivers, et cetera. We'll talk about that when we get to the prevention and safety planning section. Now, the second group, you're not going to feel too sorry for that group. You might, have some sympathy for the folks on the left, but not so much the ones on the right here. And these are people who, they're really intending harm. They see, a victim right there, and they're ready to jump in there and take advantage of them. As I said, they may, a lot of it, and we'll talk a little bit more in a few slides about who the perpetrators are and what's going on inside their heads. A lot of times they don't feel, they have no empathy, they have no really feelings of compassion or love or whatever you want to call it for the person with a developmental disability. Maybe they think this is just my job, or this person is just a pain in the butt, I just want to get through this, and not thinking they have feelings or emotions, or they don't really care how they talk to them, how they interact with them, how they treat them, etc. And again, they see these individuals as victims, and they see an opportunity to do bad things, and unfortunately they do it. When you're looking at behaviors of caregivers that are abusing and neglecting, these are some common themes, more on the, as I said, the unwilling side of the previous slide we talked about. They're displaying controlling attitudes. They're not letting the person speak for themselves. They may abuse service animals that the person is using. It's not about the person with a disability that they're providing care to, it's about them and what their needs are. As I said, they're speaking for the person. You ask the person a question and they answer for them. It's all about controlling that person and devaluing them. They're not welcome if there's say it's a person in a licensed home or some type of setting. They're not welcome for outsiders to come in and visit. They don't like that at all for obvious reasons. Maybe they switch healthcare providers a lot, because if somebody's coming in with a lot of bruises on them, well, maybe the nurse or the doctor's going to start asking questions if they keep seeing that. So they'll be switching healthcare providers a lot. These caregivers may have low self-esteem themselves. They may have the need to control others. They may have been abused or neglected as a child themselves. Unfortunately, it's kind of a vicious cycle when it comes to that. And then most importantly, that last one there, it talks about really a lack of attachment to the person. It's like, again, if you really know and value and respect and care about the person, you're not going to do these things to these people. But unfortunately, these people don't have that relationship with the person. Now, in talking about this is an important section. We talk about how do we recognize signs of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. We talk about like one thing that seems to be kind of a universal, I guess you would call it. And that has to do with change, whether it be change in a person's physical appearance, change in a person's financial status, whether it be change in how they're acting. You know, used to be they used to love to go to school or their adult day training program or wherever it is they're going. Now all of a sudden they're fearful. They start crying when it's time to go to that setting. Or if it involves a specific person, they're afraid of that. Now there's significant weight loss. All of a sudden the person looks unkempt and disheveled and, you know, et cetera. But again, it's all about the change of behavior, physical appearance, et cetera. A lot of the next several slides get into some of these things. When we talk about abuse, when we're talking about physical abuse at this point, you know, some of the most common aspects are bruises, burns, cuts, broken bones, and we'll get to each one of these in a little bit. Bruises are certainly the most common type of evidence that somebody is being physically abused. And the thing you need to look at is not just that there's a bruise, all of a sudden I saw a bruise on somebody's arm, I'm calling the abuse hotline, something horrible is going on. You need to do a little bit digging, a little bit of questioning and looking into the matter, and see, but these are some of the things we may call questionable bruises, whether a lot of times bruises on the face, bruises that the person always seems to be bruised, or they're in different parts of the body. They could be bilateral, meaning that maybe they're on the upper parts of the arm, indicating that somebody's grabbing or shaking someone. Maybe you're seeing them, maybe they're spending the weekend with dad, and then on that Monday they always seem to have a couple of unexplained bruises, or maybe they're explained but you're not really happy with the explanation. It only seems to happen during those visits. So again, those are things to really look at, and also to, if they're patterns, if they look like there's been a shape, whether they're being, whether that be a rope, a belt, etc. You want to make sure to check that out. As I said, same thing with cuts and scrapes. You want to look to see where they're located on the body. And you see it, does that seem like it kind of lines up with the explanation of how that person got that cut or scrape? Burns and scalds, again, we're looking for patterns, we're looking for location. Always very important to look at where the location is, and asking the question about, well, how did this happen? If somebody's able to tell you how it happened, well, does that make sense? And it seems like it's happening quite frequently? Because everybody cuts themselves at some point, or burns themselves, or gets a bruise, or whatever. But you need to look for those kinds of patterns. Bite marks. A lot of times you'll hear that somebody was bitten. Well, you can always blame it on the dog. Well, it's actually pretty easy to distinguish a human bite mark from a dog bite. The dog bites are usually going to be points, but the human bite marks you're going to kind of see an arc shape to indicate where the human's teeth are. So that's actually easy. And a lot of times, as I said, it's about the position, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. A lot of times individuals with significant behavioral issues, well, they're going to be covered in bruises and bite marks, etc., because they're doing it to themselves. But again, I'll talk about that in a little bit, how you can kind of factor that out or distinguish that. Ligature marks, people being tied up with ropes or whatever it is. Again, looking at patterns. Does it look like that was what was occurring? I know, again, I'm going through this quickly, but just got a lot of material to cover, and all this is in our handouts up here on this whole PowerPoint presentation. Eye and ear injuries, again, just looking at patterns, looking to see where they're occurring. These are not common injuries, so you always have to immediately go to, is this physical abuse that's occurring? Same with dental and mouth injuries, dislocated joints, fractures, and coma. As I said, there's some things you can look at when you're distinguishing abuse from, say, an accidental injury. As I said, everybody bumps themselves or hurts themselves. I do it. I'm kind of clumsy, so I do it all the time. But it's important to look at the location, where it occurs, a description of how the injury occurred. And does it make sense that if, say, somebody, he broke his arm, he fell out of a tree. Well, if he maybe uses a wheelchair and can't get in the tree in the first place, that's kind of an extreme example, but you might want to think that that's not something that they could have done by themselves. Oh, another form of abuse, as I said, would be sexual abuse. When we talk about sexual abuse, these are some of the examples we're looking at. We're looking at frequent urinary tract infections or yeast infections. Again, you got to rule some things out because I know that adults wearing diapers might be prone to having more yeast infections, for example. But these are things, again, when we look at change. All of a sudden, they never had one of these things, but now they do. Painful urination, incontinence, and somebody who previously knew how to use the bathroom by themselves. A lot of times there'll be psychosomatic symptoms, so that the things men are more likely to complain of stomach aches, the women will be more likely to complain of headaches, difficulty walking, sitting, vaginal or rectal pain. Now moving on to neglect, again, looking for the change. Okay, all of a sudden now, we're seeing a lot of bed sores. Maybe somebody who's in a wheelchair that require a lot of, they need to be positioned correctly, and all of a sudden now you're seeing with this new caregiver or in this new setting, all of a sudden now they're getting all these issues and they've never had them before. Dehydration, significant weight loss, again, all about the change. They're now having these issues. Maybe they're having seizures all the time now. Well, is that, and I know, my son has seizures and he's pretty well controlled with his medication, but if he were to miss a dose, he'd start having seizures. So, you need to look at that too as well. As I said, it's not just the physical appearance of somebody that could be a change that might lead you to believe that there's abuse, neglect, or exploitation going on. It can be behavioral signs too. Changes in the way affection is shown, if it's unusual or inappropriate. Changes in sleep patterns. All of a sudden people are having nightmares. Sudden fear, as I said, of a person or place that they were never afraid of before. Really cruelty to animals, sudden unusual interest in sexual matters. Really, again, depression, withdrawal, mood swings, any unexplained change in behavior could be an indicator that abuse, neglect, or exploitation is occurring. For individuals that are able to communicate, that's why it's important to talk to them about it. Say, hey, what's going on in your life? Anything new, different, etc. But you might need to dig a little deeper for somebody who's not able to verbally communicate how they're doing. And we'll get to that in a little bit. As I said, with financial exploitation now, it's still about the change. All of a sudden, now they're having trouble paying their bills. They're getting overdue notices. They never had problems. They have, say, on a fixed income, so why would they, I'm not seeing any new purchases made from them. Now all of a sudden they can't pay their bills. Where's that money going? Again, it's all about the changes in banking patterns. They're going to the ATM 5 times a week. Well, they never used to do that. They used to go once a month. So again, it's about when you see those changes, you need to look for explanation. Very difficult sometimes, particularly in individuals who aren't able to disclose when something bad is happening. You almost have to be kind of like a detective to see what's happening. It's difficult, as I said, because some individuals may not know or realize that what's happening to them is considered abuse, neglect, or exploitation. A lot of times when we talk about sexual abuse, people talk about, well, let's teach them about good touch and bad touch. Well, I don't really like to use those terms because a lot of times something may feel good, but if your mom or dad are touching you in that manner, it's certainly not appropriate and not okay. So there's other ways we can phrase those things. But again, it's very confusing for somebody when that's happening to them. As I said, they may not be able to communicate. As I said, a lot of times individuals with behavioral issues, well, maybe one of their behaviors is they bang their head when they're angry, or they bite themselves, etc. So they're going to have all kinds of bruises and marks and bite marks, etc. on them. So again, you need to look to see where those things are occurring. Does it make sense that they had a bruise somewhere like on their lower back? That would be really difficult for them to get it in that location. A lot of times people, again, with behavioral issues, maybe all of a sudden they start crying when it's time to go to school or be around a person. Well, then a lot of times, especially the perpetrator will chalk that up to, well, they just have autism. They just act funny. They just have behavioral issues. That's just them. But again, it's about the change. That's just very important. If they never did that before, then that is that person's way of communicating that something bad has happened to them. There's really no single way that everybody communicates, or that single, how they're responding to abuse, neglect, and exploitation. In some cases, unfortunately, there may be no outward signs at all. But again, we just need to keep focusing on the change and what you're seeing. As I said, unfortunately, you're going to have people may have unsteady gaits, maybe because of a medication they're taking. Maybe they just have some type of their disability, their medical condition. It's just something that causes them to fall a lot. So you're going to see a lot of broken bones, injuries, etc. Maybe you have AFOs or some type of brace or etc. that really it just causes some redness. Well, when you take the AFO off, you kind of rub the person's calf or something like that, then it'll go away after a couple of minutes. But these are some things to consider. There's some things that people may have failure to thrive, or poor growth, or maybe they're just really, no matter how much Ensure they drink or whatever, they can't gain any weight. It's just some metabolic issue. Now, when you're seeing these things, when you feel that things aren't adding up, you're seeing the bruises, you're seeing these patterned ligature marks, you're seeing the changes, and you're really concerned. What we encourage people to do is make a report, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, how you actually make reports. Actually, in Florida, failure to report abuse, neglect, or exploitation is actually a crime. So everybody needs to report. If you're not sure that you're kind of on the fence, we encourage people to make the report anyway, because a lot of times people, it could end up actually saving somebody's life by doing that. So we're always kind of like, better safe than sorry. But again, before you make that call, just ask some general questions, and just if you really feel strongly that this is abuse, neglect, or exploitation is taking place, by all means report it. And we'll talk about how to report in a little bit. As I said, there's no what called statute of limitations on making reports. So if somebody tells you they were abused, neglected 5 years ago, it doesn't matter. You can still make the report. There's no statute of limitations for the Department of Children and Families to investigate those types of things. It used to be that when abuse, neglect was occurring in a school, the schools had their own kind of investigations they would conduct, but the law was changed a few years ago, but now that is the Department of Children and Families. It's not an internal school investigation. It's actually going to be an official DCF, Protective Services investigation on that. A lot of people throw around the term mandatory reporter. Well, I'm a mandatory reporter, so I've got to do this, but then other people I don't like that term, because a lot of people get confused by it because they're not sure whether they're a mandatory reporter or not, and if they think they're not, they may not report. But in Florida, as I said, the law is that anybody who knows or has a suspicion that a child or a vulnerable adult is being abused, neglected, or exploited needs to report. Now, certain groups of people, I think that it's like doctors and bankers and those type of individuals, healthcare providers, teachers, they're required, when they make an abuse report to the abuse hotline, which we'll talk about in a second, are required to give certain information like their name, but others can report anonymously. Now, how do you make the report? In Florida, the Department of Children and Families, or DCF, actually operates the Florida Abuse Hotline. This is a toll-free number. It's staffed 24/7, 365 days a year. It's 1-800-96-ABUSE or 962-2873. They also accept faxes. Also, there's an email address there where you can email information as well. And they are the ones who are responsible for receiving those reports and investigating any type of abuse, neglect, or exploitation by a child or an adult with a developmental disability. Sometimes when you make that call, they'll ask a lot of questions. They're trying to get as much information from you as they can so that they can the operator can then turn it over to the actual protective services worker, that DCF investigator. But don't delay calling the hotline if you don't have all this information. They'll take whatever information you have. So whatever little information you have, just call. We don't need to be delaying anything. Once the abuse hotline is called, within 24 hours, I believe this is in the law, that DCF will make a face-to-face contact with the victim. In some cases, if the DCF investigators, except in a couple counties, it's contracted out to the local sheriff's office, but for the most part, it's just a DCF, protective services worker. It's a state employee goes out, so they don't have a badge or a gun or anything like that. So sometimes you may have the perpetrator, a lot of times, not letting that DCF protective services worker into the home. In those cases, they involve law enforcement to show up with the police, and then obviously they do let them in the home to make sure that victim is okay. A lot of times the abuse hotline will not accept a call, and there's several reasons for that. The way the law is set up, DCF receives and investigates reports of abuse or neglect or exploitation by caregivers, whether that be parents, paid caregivers, etc. But if it's just you saw somebody with a developmental disability walking down the street and they get mugged by a stranger and they beat them up and run away, that's a crime. It needs to be investigated, reported, etc. But DCF wouldn't be the ones doing that. What DCF does now is when they get those calls at the hotline, they will automatically refer those to law enforcement. It used to be they kind of put it on the person who made the report, said, no, you need to call law enforcement. But the problem is sometimes the people wouldn't follow up and call law enforcement, but now DCF actually makes that referral themselves to make sure. If you feel like someone's in immediate jeopardy, you're seeing a crime actually being committed, don't fool around with the hotline. Just call 911 as you would with anything else if you feel like somebody's life is in imminent danger. Unfortunately, a lot of times people, as I said, the person who is being victimized doesn't realize that this is a problem. They may know nothing else, as I said. They may not think they'll be believed, for example. Maybe they have a communication issue and they can't tell anybody. They don't have a communication board or any kind of way to tell somebody what's happening. They may feel like maybe they reported previously, it wasn't believed. Nobody will believe them. A lot of times people maybe be socially isolated. They may be depending on that person who is actually abusing, neglecting, or exploiting them to get them out of bed in the morning, to feed them, to get them their medications. Just imagine how scary that is to feel like that's the only person in my life. That's my lifeline to the world, to being able to live, and they're the ones who are harming me. What's going to happen to me if I make that report? Am I going to end up in a nursing home? What's going to happen to me? So a lot of times people are afraid to make that report, the person with a developmental disability. Now when it comes to the public, a lot of times you might see something. You might see the red flags we talked about. But you, in your mind, the back of your mind may think, oh, nobody would ever think to harm this sweet person. This person with a developmental disability. And unfortunately, as I said, if you look at the statistics and the prevalence, these crimes are happening every single day in the world, America, Florida, etc. So, we need to really always have that in the back of our minds, that this is such a common problem. When we see that bruise, let's start thinking and asking those questions. It's just very important. Some people may feel that they may face some kind of retaliation if they make a report. They may think that their actions won't have a difference. They think they're going to get sued if they call the abuse hotline on somebody, etc. But as I said earlier, the abuse hotline is confidential, so that if you can make the call and they just want your information, they don't necessarily need your name. If you're, I say, fortunate enough where someone with a developmental disability is actually able to disclose to you that they're being abused, neglected, or exploited, I say it's, fortunate, but it's a horrible thing to be confronted with, but at the very least, somebody's approaching you, reaching out to help. They're really in pain, they need, they're really having this problem, and they come to you. And again, these should be your 4 kind of responses to that person when they come forward with that disclosure that something bad is happening to them. Even if you have to keep it really simple for somebody to say with an intellectual disability, even if you just have to say these words, that's just very important for you to communicate this message to the person that you believe them, that it's not their fault, that they're not alone, that you want to help them. When somebody makes the report, whether the person with a developmental disability themselves or a friend, a family member, whoever, a lot of things have to happen right in order for really justice to be served and that person to be protected and safe from going forward. First off, we talk about education and training. People need to know, what is what's okay, what's not okay. They need to, like kind of this session today, they need to look for the signs and symptoms and know what's happening. Secondly, when they see these red flags, these signs and symptoms, they need to know how to report, who to report to. That report, most importantly, needs to be made. Then the people who investigate, whether it be law enforcement, whether it be DCF, they have to know what they're doing. They have to be able to communicate effectively with the victim. They need to be able to, interview, other witnesses perhaps. They need to do a really good, thorough investigation. And then, at the point where that's all occurring, then, typically DCF sends their investigation results over to the state attorney's office. These people have to be prosecuted and convicted, and that's very important because when we're talking about, say, service providers, et cetera, or even family members, it's important to get that person away from the person with the developmental disability. When we talk about service providers, that is what causes you to have like a disqualifying criminal offense when people do background screenings. If cases are not prosecuted and convicted, and people aren't convicted, then you have no hits on you. You have your background screening will come back clear, and you'll continue to have access to this vulnerable population. And then finally, you need to make sure that the person, as the previous slide said, that they have access to services, supports, counseling, whether they need a new place to live, whatever it is that they need to help them get through this, get over it, and be safe again. Okay, finally, the best part of the presentation, the most important part of the presentation, we talk about all this. The most important thing is prevention. We want to prevent these things from occurring. Uh-oh. All right, well. Well, at least I can see it. We talk about, Bailey, can you try and fix this? We talk about prevention. We talk about like primary prevention and secondary prevention. Primary prevention is things that we can do, activities we can do to prevent abuse, neglect, or exploitation from occurring in the first place. One of the most important components of primary prevention is education and self-protection information directly to the person with a developmental disability. There's a lot of good information out there, a lot of training materials that talk about, okay, it's okay for mom and dad to hug me, but not the guy who delivers the pizza. Those kinds of things. It's very important about who has access to your body and how people should treat you and all that kind of stuff. Because, quite frankly, you want your child, your loved one, to be safe. But there's no way that unless you have the means to hire a bodyguard that's with them 24/7, there's no way that's going to happen. They're going to be by themselves at certain points, so it's important to get that information out to them. Let them know that they need to tell somebody if there's a problem. When we talk about education and training, we'll also talk about teaching people skills that will like independent living skills, I guess you'd call it. So that if they can know how to go to the bathroom by themselves, well then you're taking away an opportunity from one of these abusive caregivers to have that access to them. If you're teaching them, getting them a job, then all of a sudden they have the means to support themselves, and they're not as reliant upon an abusive or neglectful caregiver. All of a sudden they're taught how to take their own medication, make their own food, etc. Anything that we can do to get people so that they're less reliant upon others to do these kinds of personal, intimate, like daily living care. As I said, we need to teach people what's okay and what's not okay, as far as how people talk to you, how people treat you, how people, handle you, position you in your wheelchair, etc. That's just very important, that they need to understand that they are entitled their due respect, humane care, etc. They need to know that there is somebody that they can talk to, that they can go to if they ever feel strange or uncomfortable. Even if they can't articulate what's happening, maybe they just feel weird around somebody, they don't like how somebody's interacting with them, etc. It's just very, very important for them to be able to disclose. A lot of times when you're talking to people, a lot of times you don't ask questions like yes or no questions, like are you being abused? You wouldn't ask a question like that. You would say things more like, how is everything going? Just general open-ended questions. Do you like going to this school? Do you like living in this place? Etc. And just let them be able to tell you, and then you can ask some more probing questions later on. As I said, it's important for people to understand what's appropriate, not appropriate, both for their own behavior and the behavior of others. A lot of times, is being a parent, before I was a parent of children with disabilities, I worked as a care provider. And I can't tell you, there have been so many times I've had people with intellectual disabilities, say with Down syndrome, they meet me for the first time, they want to come up to me and give me a big bear hug. And I always kind of redirect them into giving them a high five or a handshake, because they don't know me. They don't know, I'm a nice guy, but they don't know that. A lot of people will look at me like, well, what's this guy's problem? What a jerk. Why doesn't he just hug the guy? And I'm like, no, I don't do that with people I don't know that well. And by encouraging that kind of behavior by older individuals, you're really kind of setting them up for a risky situation, where then all of a sudden they think it's okay for strangers to be rubbing up all over their bodies, and they think that's okay. So again, it's about establishing boundaries. When we talk some more kind of primary prevention, sorry about that, I'm not sure what happened here. When we talk about primary prevention, we talk about background screening and reference checks. Very important. As I said, background screening, if you're talking about providers that are paid for by the state, whether that be Medicaid or APD or anything like that, they have to go through a background screening. But honestly, a lot of times, as I talked about, if those people aren't being caught, or prosecuted and convicted, that's really not going to show much. You really want to take it a step further. It's important to talk to other people that, say, have received services from the person, to see, how that person is. It's always scary, because as I said, my children receive services through APD, and if I say, originally I would ask our support coordinator, say, okay, I'd like to find a respite provider. And, my support coordinator is great. He'd give me a list, names on a list. I'm like, well, I'm not going to, have this, I don't know any of these people on this list. I'm not going to, how would I possibly know who's, how that person is, so that was kind of frustrating. So it helped, to really, interview the person really well, find out, what they're like, and then really talk to other people that I knew. That's actually how I ended up doing it. I talked to other families of kids with disabilities at my kid's school, and said, well, which respite provider do you use? Are you happy with them, etc.? And then we even actually got to the point where we actually found people we knew and liked and trusted, maybe people that were working with them at Sunday school at church, or the aides in my kids' classes, and we got them to actually enroll as providers through either the CDC program, or before there was CDC, we were just the regular Medicaid provider. So that really, gave us some assurance. So that was very helpful, not just making sure the background screening is clear. Some other things that primary prevention, you want to look at growing social circles. This is really shown to be like a protective factor for people for a couple reasons. One, it's like the perpetrators are less likely to go after somebody that has a lot of friends. There's a lot of eyes and ears around this person, so they're not alone by themselves. There's people that would see that, if I was going to do something bad to them, there's a lot of people that would see and get in my business, and I'll move on to somebody else who's more isolated. As I said, the respite for caregivers is very important. Remember the chart I showed with the unwilling and unable. When we talk about respite, it's very important that that they get breaks periodically. And this applies to not only say family members, but I've seen this in some group homes where people have to work, say, a double shift, or they do those kinds of crazy work hours on a regular basis. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to do bad things are going to happen because of a lack of rest. The training, very, very important, that you have somebody, for example, with a behavior plan, that the people who are providing care, everybody in that person's little circle knows what's in that behavior plan. What are the target behaviors? What do I do when somebody starts banging their head, etc.? Everybody's on the same page, whether that be school, whether that be, your family members, your paid carers, anybody who's responsible for providing care to that person. It's very important. Again, educating people on what's considered abuse, neglect, exploitation, making sure they understand sexual activity with this person is never going to be okay. It's actually illegal. And as family members, it's important for us to be familiar with what other caregivers, whether it be schools, group homes, etc., are doing, that to make sure you're okay with it. There are certain laws in Florida that talk about restraint and seclusion in schools, for example, how that should occur. Well, just make sure that, your actual classroom where your child is receiving services are doing those things, and that you're okay with those things. I mean, it helps to see if you're doing one thing at home, they're doing the same thing at the school or some other setting. Secondary prevention is basically, it's kind of after the abuse and neglect exploitation has occurred. It's really intended to kind of stop it from continuing to occur so that the person can become safe again. As I said, this kind of like what we talked about today is training caregivers, training really the world on recognizing the signs and symptoms of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. A lot of times it's making visits, whether it be to schools, to group homes, to people in their own apartments, at various times of the day, various days of the week, etc. So that there's really not, okay, if the abusive caregiver knows this person's friend only comes on this day, of course everything's going to be wonderful at that time. But if they come maybe a different day, maybe not so much. As I said, cooperating with police and investigators is very important so that we can get good, thorough investigations. Very important. So we can get those perpetrators out of the world of the person with the disability. A lot of times, as I said, unfortunately, people may not be able to speak, so there are a lot of different things that people that use communication boards. There's a lot of things that they can use to communicate that something bad is happening to them, that they're being abused, neglected, or exploited. Now, the expansion of social circles is also here on the secondary prevention as well as the primary prevention. Just because, again, the more people you have in a person's life, that's more eyes and ears, that's more likely somebody's going to see something, start questioning, make a report, and then ultimately the report is received, investigated, hopefully prosecution, conviction, but that ultimately that person is going to be made safe again. Now the agency, and I encourage you, we got a lot of information up here, make sure you take that. I've got my card up here. We have a website on the apdcares.org, and at the very bottom you'll see Zero Tolerance Initiative. And as I said, that's just the fancy name we gave to all of our activities, whether that be doing putting forth various laws, rules, policies, etc., just intended to prevent abuse, neglect, and exploitation from occurring. occurring. We kind of broke it into various components where there's, we're doing training and education. We have a mandatory provider training, like I say, about 4 hours. That kind of is a more expanded version of what you're hearing today. We talk about, monitoring, quality improvements. We're kind of looking at various, when we talk about monitoring group homes or people in various settings, there's certain things that our staff now are trained to look for, some of these signs and symptoms. We'll look at trends. We'll look at, like, say, incident reports, where it's all of a sudden it seems like this person seems to be getting hurt a lot. They're going to the hospital a lot. Well, that kind of prompts us to do a little bit more digging, ourselves, APD would. As I said, there's various proposing rules, laws, whether that be strengthening the background screening requirements. Well, we've been successful in recommending some various legislative changes, and we've had that happen. It's been very good. And then finally, kind of the last bullet, like public awareness. That's exactly what I'm doing here, and it's just so important to get the word out to everybody. And there's our website again. These slides are all up here. I encourage you to take some of these handouts. My business card is up here on the table, and there's my direct number if you'd like to speak to me. And I said at the beginning, for those of you who came in later, I will be in the exhibit hall from 8 to 10 tomorrow morning. If you want to talk to me then at the APD booth. And I will also, there's my phone number, email, if you want to talk to me privately. If you don't want to, if you have a specific situation you're concerned about, by all means, let me know. And finally, thanks so much for coming. Appreciate it, everybody. Anybody, how much time I got, Bailey? Bailey, you're my timekeeper. Oh, wow, I went over. Okay, well, anybody got any questions? Okay, thanks again for coming. Don't forget to take the stuff. That's the less I have to take back to Tallahassee. Appreciate it, everybody.